welcome everybody to this special guest session with Tom Phillips. I'm really pleased to welcome Tom again. He's become a bit of a regular, addressing our students. I think it's been mostly online these last few years because you've been based in Bulgaria, obviously, and much as we'd love to fly you over to do stuff in person, we don't quite have the budget of that, sadly. Maybe one day we will, or if you're back in the country, you can join us in person at some point. I find it really hard to introduce you, Tom, because you've done so much and you've covered so many bases, but you've also had this absolutely unique career, which I can't imagine has been sort of so dissimilar to any other writer, but in the best possible way, because you've been a journalist and a travel writer. You are a traveler, and you are all those things, but your career is very interesting, the sort of phases of that. A very accomplished poet, widely published translator. You've worked in radio. You were involved in the Venue magazine, now legendary Venue magazine in Bristol, at that crucial time in sort of British cultural history, of lots of incredible music coming from that part of the world. And you were sort of on the front line of that, which is always, you've got so many great anecdotes about that. But I thought we'd just begin by, it's not too cliche, just sort of go back to, I don't know, your origin story and thinking about sort of first writing that you did, and maybe what, I mean, it's such a cliche, isn't it? But like, what there's almost a bit Alan Partridge, isn't it? And what inspired you to be a writer when you were young, Tom? But I think that's, I'm always interested. Everyone has a different reason, a different motivation, and I'd just be really interested to hear yours to sort of kick off with, and then we can maybe sort of go chronologically, or however you want to go through, as I say, talking about all the different genres that you've embraced and sort of made your own, because we've got, I think even with a small group like this, we've got quite a range of interests, and as I say, you've covered a lot of those areas of writing. So yeah, so going back to kind of maybe the first kind of writing you ever did that you can remember, and why you sort of wanted to make writing the sort of focus of your life going forward, really.
Yeah, sure, Tom, of course. I mean, it's interesting thinking about it and trying to pin it down. And I think the thing I'd just say to begin with is I think the motivation has changed at different points in my life. So right at the beginning, I remember the first thing I ever wrote, I think, of my own free will, as it were, not that wasn't sort of schoolwork, was a kind of jokey poem about Christmas. And I showed it to my mother and she really liked it. And I read it at their kind of adult Christmas party. I was about 12, I think. And I realized, gosh, this is a great way to show off. So it was almost as if, it doesn't sound very laudable, but the sort of first motive was actually just egotism, really. And I find it quite interesting that I think George Orwell puts egotism as one of his sort of four main motives for writing. But more seriously, I suppose that, I guess I really started writing work that, I can still bear to look at, as it were, when I was starting university. And then I think I'd just come back from Australia, where I'd been for about 6 months. And I think it was noticeable that I started writing in relation to travel. I mean, these were actually poems, but I think it was me trying to make sense of what I'd seen and experienced. And I think that's kind of continued to be perhaps a common factor in getting things going. Something will happen and I don't quite understand it, or I don't understand my reaction to it. And so that's kind of what motivates me to write, I think. So it sort of went from,
Sorry, no,
it sort of went.
Go on.
I was just going to say, so it went from showing off to sort of trying to understand the world a bit better.
Yeah. So on that exact, I'm really, really intrigued to hear that, because, and I wonder, that sort of idea of writing to understand the world and engage with the world and sort of get a sense of your place in the world is really, I think, a really fascinating motivation, and probably quite, I think, probably resonates with anyone who writes or wants to write, but that they will have their own sort of version of that one. And I was just interested, when you got back from Australia and you were sort of writing poetry about that experience, can you think, I mean, if it's not, you know, if you can remember, or if it's not too far back in time, were there certain things that about that experience that made sense to you only after you wrote about them? And if so, can you remember what kind of insights you got into that trip from writing poetry about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things was um, actually trying to understand a bit about, well, but let's be honest, white Australian society and sort of what it was doing in the country. So there's a little bit, actually, there's also a little bit of political motivation, I think. I remember being absolutely horrified by the way that, white Australians talked about, the indigenous population and the way they treated them and things. And I remember one, for example, I took a photo in Brisbane, just in a park, of a guy, Aboriginal guy, just sleeping on the grass. And it was just, you couldn't tell who he was. He was just a figure because he was lying flat on the ground and facing away from it and everything. So, but behind him was this, was the whole of Brisbane, these skyscrapers and whatever. I just thought that's a really interesting image. I'm not a great photographer, but I just thought it was an interesting image. And I can remember showing it actually to my cousin who I was staying with. And she just kind of said, "Why do you take that picture? What do you take that for?" And I said, "Isn't it really interesting?" And it was just like, uh, so, it was kind of trying to find out, why I felt certain things and why other people seemed to feel something rather different. So something about that, I think.
And then and this was, you've been writing poetry for ever since, I guess. And were there sort of certain kind of other aspects of life that you wanted to explore with your poetry once you were back in the UK? And was there a sort of change in your focus and the sort of themes that you were interested in from that point on?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think after that, and again, I was writing quite a lot while I was at university and immediately afterwards. And I think one thing I was very interested in, I know, was that so we're talking about the kind of mid to late 1980s. And one thing that I was really interested in was how, using more demotic, more conversational language in actual poetry. So there's a sort of aesthetic interest as well. And so I can remember, trying to write in a much simpler language, and so on and so on. And that kind of led, in the mid 90s, I, started doing, well, what was then called performance poetry, which is now called spoken word, basically standing up on stage and reading work. And again, and that I think became, that moved in a very different direction and became much more sort of satirical and openly political, and about what was going on. I mean, I seem to remember writing quite a lot of poems about, well, it was the gentrification of our neighborhood. We were living in Bristol at the time, and sort of what was going on in South Bristol at that period was really very interesting in terms of the way the society was changing and so on, and the sort of old working class communities being, well, basically, frankly, dying off. I mean, because they were mostly retired factory workers and things, and then their houses being bought by people from, elsewhere and so on. So those kind of things kind of drove me a lot. And then I think what happened then, which was quite interesting for me, was that I also started writing for the theatre around the sort of turn of the millennium. I guess that would be. And I think a lot of the sort of stuff that was driving me to want to write satirically actually went into the plays. Because I remember when uh, I published a book of poems in about 2012. And I remember actually Richard Jones, who you know very well in Bristol, wrote a very kind article about it in the then Bristol Review of Books. And his sort of opening gambit was, well, if you read this book, you won't believe it's by Tom Phillips because you're used to this guy who stands up on stage and is incredible, you know, really ironic and scathing and kind of, you know, quite I was quite rude, I have to say. And suddenly there was this book of sort of right kind of complete in a completely different style, much closer to what I'd been writing when I very first started, much more lyrical poetry, you know, and so on. And so again, that must represent a sort of change of motivation, I think, and perhaps a bit more going back to more of this idea of trying to make sense of the world and where you are and so on. And I think it was very interesting for me too when we moved to Bulgaria more than 8 years ago now. I found that I wrote a tremendous amount of work when we first moved here, and I think that must be this kind of idea of you're in somewhere new, somewhere unfamiliar, so the writing process is part of the process of familiarizing yourself with the place and sort of forming attachments to it and so on.
Sorry, forgive me. I should have mentioned it when your intro that you're also a playwright as well. I forgot that as journalist, poet, travel writer, play. So yeah, I mean, I wondered if you did you get into writing plays? Sorry, you said after doing quite a lot of spoken word performances.
Mm.
So was that a kind of natural step to sort of write for other performers off the back of, or had you sort of been interested in playwriting sort of earlier than that when you were a student or when you were younger or
Yeah, well, I mean, rather weirdly, I wrote my first play at about the age of 11. Um, and it was actually put on by my primary school, much to my surprise. Um, uh, and then I didn't really write anything. I didn't think about playwriting after that, really. But I did do quite a bit of acting in a non-professional capacity. And I suppose, you know, I'd always been interested in theatre. Then I was reviewing theatre for Venue
mm,
magazine as well as part of my job as a journalist. So I kind of went, you know, did the classic poacher gamekeeper thing and went from being a theatre critic to actually writing plays. So again, and I think that mainly has been playwriting is slightly different again in terms of the motive for me anyway. You know, I think that largely comes about from having a story that you want to tell,
mm.
because otherwise you think it's not going to be ever heard and you think it's of some importance. So, you know, um, yeah, I mean, one of the last plays that was put on in Britain before I left was called Coastal Defences, and it's actually set in Bulgaria, funnily enough. And that came about because there will be what 2000, it was written in 2013. And that was the year that there were massive um, pro-democracy, anti-corruption demonstrations in Bulgaria. I mean, really huge, went on for months and months and months. Didn't get reported at all in Britain. You know, and it just so happened that on one of the biggest days of the protests, the BBC showed one of those kind of dreadful documentaries about, I don't know if you've heard of Sunny Beach, but I mean, it's notorious, the Magaluf of the Black Sea, where people go on cheap holidays and get absolutely plastered, behave really badly, and then blame the Bulgarians for selling them beer too cheaply. You know, so these two things, I thought, you know, so to write that. I just wanted to, and a lot of people who came to see it said, God, I didn't know anything about Bulgaria before, and it's really interesting, to find out about it.
And when you as as someone who has written in a lot of forms and choosing, I'm just interested in how you might choose to write a play about a play or a poem or a piece of prose, and whether there's something about a particular subject or a story that you want to tell that lends itself more to the conventions of theatre or poetry, and whether that's a very conscious decision that you make, or is it kind of unconscious, or you just go with a sort of a gut feeling as to what form that you want to work in for whatever story you want to tell.
Mm. I mean, I don't tend to know it too well in advance. I don't suddenly think, oh, that's a poem, play, story, whatever. When I actually see something or experience something, I mean, most of my writing comes from very, very tiny things. I don't sit down and think, oh, I'm going to write a poem about war or something, or I'm going to write a play about this. It usually starts from some tiny detail, and then then it sort of slowly evolves, and I think, oh yeah, okay, this isn't what I thought it was. This is something else, or it might be that, in other words, it might be that I start writing something in one particular genre or medium, and kind of realize after a while that that's not quite the right one, and that actually what I'm writing is closer to being, let's say, a play, for argument's sake. Or sometimes the same stories just become different things, like
Yeah.
some of the incidents that I wrote about in my PhD thesis, so travel writing about Albania. Some of the events in that book are form the core of a one-man show that I wrote and performed. But then other incidents are sort of crop up in poems and so on. So sometimes it's a case of, like I say, sort of trying one form and then realizing actually what I'm doing is writing something else. And it would work much better, in a different form.
And in terms of sort of finding these subjects, and again, at the risk of another cliche question, where do you get your ideas from? But I mean, is that is that, how conscious is that? Does it come from a place? I mean, from what you were saying sort of earlier about writing satirically in response to kind of current affairs and politics, did that come from a place of kind of, I don't know, slight anger with what was going on, or sense of wanting to dissent from what was happening at that time? But then I suppose other would it be fair to sort of say that sort of other pieces of writing that you've done that haven't been so political, do they come from, what's the kind of thinking, what are you trying to achieve with those sorts of ideas? Is it something to do with, I don't know, catharsis, or is it just, it seems like a good idea and aesthetically a nice image that you can work with, or what?
Yeah, I mean, actually, I mean, one thing I haven't mentioned is that, I also have now find myself making a decision about which language I'm going to write something in. Because I do write in Bulgarian as well as English. And I think there's a difference between the two languages in terms of your question. So, for example, because I'm a non-native speaker of Bulgarian, it tends to be much more driven by the language. I write in a certain way because that's how I can write in Bulgarian. So I don't write in my head in English and then translate it. I actually try and think in that language. and the kind of work that I've written in Bulgarian, when you translate it back into English, it's very different to the stuff that I write in English, and you can see that the thought processes are different, and they often come just from like from a language source, as it were. So it's a kind of finding an interesting combination of words, and then thinking, oh well, that takes me in this direction, and so on. Whereas the stuff I write in English, I mean, the ideas can come from anywhere, really. You know, I was quite well, the example I sometimes use is I had quite a longish poem, well, by my standards, not very long, by my standards, which I actually wrote about. I was saying we have a little balcony on our apartment here, and the apartment's in a building that was built in 1914. So it was obviously kind of it's only 4 stories, so it was obviously one big house, probably a merchant's house. And I was sitting on our balcony, and I looked, and there was this kind of sort of very, very decayed little bar of wood sticking out of the wall on top of the sort of metal railing on the balcony. And I thought, what's that? And I realized, of course, that once had a much grander wooden railing around the top of the cast iron one. And so I started thinking about, okay, so what kind of person would have, stood here? And I would be probably someone very, around the time of the First World War. So it was about that. And I sort of to the left, and like many older buildings in Sofia, there's this kind of sort of a tangle of electric wires just hanging out of the wall. They're not connected to anything anymore, but they're, it's like a whole bunch of dreadlocks in wire form. And I thought, well, I wonder where that comes from. I wonder if that's from when they put electricity originally into the building, probably around the communism. So it's like the sort of history of Bulgaria was sort of kind of seemed to me to be, there were traces of that, even just sitting outside our, on our balcony. So, and kind of then what happened, I think, is that, my mind started sort of riffing on that idea and thinking about the changes in the country and so on and so on, and how it had left those changes has left their marks. So, I mean, that's I suppose, quite an example of where a poem comes from.
Yeah.
I mean, I think plays often come from, actually, well, again, it's quite often, it's what you hear people say on the bus and stuff.
Yeah.
It's that kind of thing. You just hear a little short passage of dialogue and think, oh, that's a really interesting, what does that tell you about, these people's relationship or something, or about, a topic in general,
That's really interesting, and it's funny you mentioned buses, because I mean, we know each other from Bristol when I was living there, and you were there for much longer than I was, and you were very much more established there. But I used to find getting buses in Bristol absolutely fascinating for the sort of eavesdrop. I don't know what it is about that place. I mean, maybe in London, on the underground or something like that, you could have the same diversity of experiences. You sort of hear someone plotting a burglary on that side, and then someone planning a spoken word event on that side, and someone having an argument with their partner. And that's a really fertile for you. That's a really sort of fertile source of inspiration for not just writing drama, but also, I mean, could a poem emerge from that, or a short story emerge from I mean, I suppose there's no strict boundaries between these things.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's sort of a combination of that what we were talking about earlier about, how do I decide what something's going to be. So it will probably depend wholly on what's overheard or whatever. And I was pleased to discover that apparently Harold Pinter used to do that all the time. He'd travel around London on night buses. That's where lots of ideas for his play or his
That makes sense, actually,
characters
doesn't it? Yeah,
perhaps.
yeah.
come from. So I don't feel so bad about it. Yeah, yeah.
You think something like The Caretaker, and the sort of grunginess of that, and the sort of the characters that he creates. It's that that really makes sense. Um, so you you started right. So it seems like poetry was your sort of first love as a writer, and that's what you did initially, and it's remained obviously a big focus of yours. But I just wondered, like, were there sort of skills that you learned as a poet and as a creative writer in that broad sense that were kind of transferable to when you moved into journalism at all, or is journalism a completely different sort of
yeah,
skill set? Or
yeah, I mean, completely. And I mean, and you know, I should say, to be clear, I suppose that it's very specifically arts journalism that I was involved in, really. I mean, I wrote articles about other things, because the magazine had a venue in particular had a wider remit. But so I think, yeah, I mean, there are lots of transferable skills, and I think perhaps one of them, the most important one, was sort of learning to say as much as you can in as few words as possible. The kind of real having to condense something down to the absolute essence. And I think certainly, poetry helps with that, because that's very much a part of what it's about. And I suppose also just being being hyper aware, perhaps too much, maybe at least overthinking, but sort of aware of ambiguities. And like in poetry, ambiguities are useful. In journalism, not so much. But, well, if at all, really. But being able to sort of recognize that, and that kind of close attention to detail. I thought it was very interesting. I was one of the sub-editors on Venue. Well, there were two of us, and we both wrote poetry, which I thought was quite interesting. So it's that sort of attention to language.
And in terms of the sorts of stories that you wrote for Venue and during that, during your sort of journalistic career, I mean, are there any that sort of stand out as being kind of particularly extraordinary topics that, made for particularly engaging stories and that, were eye-opening? I know we mentioned some previously, and I don't know, maybe you could, talk about those again, or I'm sure there are others that you could mention, but just give us a sense of the kind of which I guess there's that idea of the angle, isn't there? That sort of unique approach to a particular topic, and just anything that sort of stands out for you from that time as being a particularly quirky or strange story that you kind of picked up on.
Yeah, sure. I mean, actually, one of the first features I ever wrote for Venue that I sort of long had this idea, I really wanted to write something about life in Bristol prison, and what it was actually like, because I don't think people know a great deal about prison, because you don't normally go there unless you are unfortunate reasons. But and it took forever to get permission from the Home Office, but eventually they did let me in. I mean, admittedly for only one day, and of course the only prisoner I was allowed to interview one-to-one was the best behaved prisoner ever, and was about to be released for good behavior. Although, and the press officer was with me the whole time, and kind of, although there was one very telling moment where she took me actually, funny enough, into a creative writing class. And for some reason, she and the teacher had to go out of the room for a minute. So I was left with these like 5, 6 people, and they were all in for life, for murder. I mean, distressingly young. And I thought, this is interesting. I'm stuck in a room with 5 murderers. Great. And of course they were really nice. And then I got the truth. about what it was really like in about, I had about 2 minutes. And then these guys told me about, the bad stuff that went on and kind of, so that was kind of eye-opening, and so on. And I also, in a slightly different uh, vein, I mean, we used to have a whole section on like kind of places you could go for the day out. And one of my wheezes, I thought, what's the most unlikely day out you can have in Bristol? And I thought, I know, let's go to Severn Beach, which, used to be a kind of seaside resort, but has long since been practically deserted. I mean, it's just a commuter hub now, and it's pretty run down. So we took my wife Sarah and I, no, I don't think Sarah came, but anyway, I took the kids there, and of course, it was absolutely belting with rain, thoroughly miserable. And it was just a joy to write, and kind of like, and the kids hated me, and there's this fantastic picture of us stood on Severn Beach, which is just basically a kind of horribly polluted shingle lump at this stage, anyway. And it looks as if someone's just tipped a bucket of water over our heads. And the reason I mentioned that one is that about a year later, my daughter Lydia came home from secondary school clutching this photocopied sheet that she'd given in her English class. And it was my article about going to Severn Beach. So it was actually kind of, it was taught at secondary school. And Lydia said, look, that's me. They didn't realize that she was so wet in the picture. But so that was I quite like those kind of things.
So this was taught
A little bit unusual or anything that, I mean, I kind of took that, we took that to extremes. We,
Sorry, Tom, you're breaking up a bit. I don't know. We just the can you hear us and see us okay? You've sort of frozen a bit, and the last
okay.
can you hear us okay, or might just be one way the problem? Or
Oh, am I?
yeah, sorry, we've lost you now completely. I think I don't know if you can still hear
Yeah,
us.
I can hear you. Our internet can be a bit wobbly. Um, it should be okay. Anyway, yeah.
Tom, can you still hear us? Or I mean, I wonder if maybe going out and coming back
God,
into.
yeah, it's really. Okay. I don't know.
Can you I don't know whether you're speaking now and we can't hear you, or because your image is frozen, but we could sort of I could sort of hear you when you last spoke. I don't know if you can hear us though. That's probably yeah.
Uh,
Oh,
Oh, hello.
that seems a bit better. We can see you now, and I think we
Oh,
can.
good. Okay, yeah, sorry, I don't know
Yeah,
what. I think it's probably um our yeah, possibly our internet. I don't know. Anyway,
that's better
um
anyway. Yeah, good. All right.
yeah, okay. Yeah, so I mean, like I say, a lot of it was just going and doing something a bit daft, really,
Yeah.
or sending other people to do things. I mean, you alluded to that was an article which I didn't actually write, but I commissioned when I was the editor. I sent the actual visual art editor to investigate dogging, uh, and he kind of came back with this remarkably graphic article about it. And
Yeah.
I didn't even really think about not publishing it, so I
Mm.
did. And apparently it almost had um, the magazine put on the top shelf of newsagents because it was deemed to be, a
Wow.
little bit too risque. But,
Just that issue would have
which is
been
kind of
on the
fun.
top shelf.
Yeah.
Not you wouldn't have been consigned to the X-rated sort of world forever, would you? Or was it just that issue that was deemed to be a bit racy? Ooh.
No, 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 no. That was yeah, 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 exactly. But yeah, so there are those kind of things, kind of.
Yeah. I wonder if anyone else has a question for Tom. I mean, I've got more, but so it's an opportunity whether people want to type one in the little message box or whether they want
Okay.
to speak to him. Anyone
Hi,
wants to?
Tom.
Hmm.
I just wanted to pick up on something you said about how when you were writing poetry for the
Hmm.
Venue magazine, it was an object lesson in brevity and only using those words which you needed, and uh, how that translated or didn't when you were writing scripts, because inevitably some characters in plays can be very wordy because that's part of their character. So I just wondered if you could say a little bit about your approach to script writing. Oh, I think you might have frozen. I can't hear anything at all.
Ooh.
Tom, did you hear what I said, or
Oh,
was it lost?
I just missed the second part, I think, Tracy. Sorry, if you could
Yes.
just.
So I think I would, after saying that, I think occasionally you'll have characters when you're script writing who are wordy because that's part of their character. How the need for brevity translates into script writing when you're doing that.
Okay, no, that's a really interesting question. I mean, um, I think it comes from the process actually of the way I write scripts, maybe. And I quite often just get characters talking to each other and probably not really saying anything of great importance, but I'm kind of learning who those characters are, So it's a sort of educational process for me. So and then it kind of is a case of taking a lot of stuff out because it's just filler, really. So um, kind of learning um, how little characters sometimes have need to say for you to get a situation across. The classic use of subtext, I suppose, is what I mean. And like you say, there are exceptions. There are characters who are extremely wordy because that's their character, or they speak in a particular type of language. One play of mine, it's called 100 Miles North of Timbuktu,
You've
and
frozen again, Tom.
it's a program that means, oh, have I? Okay.
We can hear you
Oh,
now. Just I think that's whatever you said
okay.
after Timbuktu, if you could
Yeah.
repeat that. Yeah.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah. So it's about a guy who invents software that allows you to control the weather anywhere in the world from your laptop. Okay. So who knows? At the time when I wrote it, that was science fiction. It may not, who knows? And it was interesting how, one character speaks as if he's just come out, just digested a rather bad business school textbook. So he speaks all these terrible cliches, going forward and nonsense. And then there's another guy who's the computer genius who speaks in this kind of weird, kind of amalgam of scientific terms, which are just, made up. So it was quite, that's actually, I suppose, both of those characters are quite wordy people, and that's very much the part of their character. And sort of, actually, I suppose the other interesting one that might interest you on that in terms of real experiences, that play I mentioned about Bulgaria, Coastal Defences. I actually worked with the director on that for 6 months before we started rehearsing, which is really unusual. You don't often get that opportunity in the theatre. And I wanted to write quite a panoramic play, so with quite a lot of characters in it, but I knew we'd only have 3 actors, so they'd be doing a lot of doubling up, and they hated me when they came to rehearsal, but they loved it in the end. But it was very interesting working with this director, because he just kind of continually encouraged me to cut it down, keep cutting it down, keep cutting it down. And when we actually got to the rehearsals, I was really quite nervous, because I thought, we've cut out so much. Will people actually be able to understand what's going on? And I was really relieved on opening night, when they did the first performance, and I got to speak to people in the audience afterwards. And I said, did you know what was happening? Did you get it? And they said, yeah, absolutely, no problem. So that was a really good object lesson in, actually, as long as you get the detail, as long as you pick the right details, it's amazing how much people will get from that. And I assume that's the case with, well, I mean, I guess it is with reading something too, so it kind of, I think it does transfer itself a little bit into the playwriting. But that may vary from one situation to another, I think.
Okay, thank you.
Just to follow up on that, with Tom, with playwriting, I mean, I guess, you're talking about sort of economy of language, but do you also have to be kind of a bit economical with, the story and the action itself? Because I think I remember having a go at writing plays when I was at school, and talking to someone who was sort of, and at uni actually, I seem to remember, and talking to someone who was a director, and they knew about the theatre and they knew how it worked, and I didn't really. I was just sort of busking it, and they said to me, this can't be a play, because you've got something like 20 locations and you've got scenes that are far too short. You're thinking of this in terms of like a fast cutting sort of movie from that, probably like it was in the 90s, so it was all these kind of train spotting and these very sort of trendy, fast cutting, fast paced kind of. And so that made me think, okay, yeah, you have to be quite disciplined, don't you? Is that something that comes naturally or came easily to you when you started writing plays, or was it something you had to kind of rein in the vision? Because what you just described there seems like quite a bit, that sort of science fictional sort of scale of things. For a stage play, that seems like it could grow and become like something more akin to a film that might need special effects and lots of different actors and lots of different settings. But was there a process where you had to kind of, I don't know, yeah, sort of bring that down to a manageable sort of story or scale? Did you had to was there a kind of process of, yeah, sort of cutting bits of the story in order to make it more practical to perform on stage for actors? And presumably another question, just wondered what venue you held it in, and whether how much of a difference that makes, what the size of the stage is, the theatre, and those sort of practical aspects. Sorry, it's a long-winded, probably two questions in there. Just answer it however you like.
Yeah.
Sorry, I think there might be a delay, or you're
right.
frozen again.
No,
Tom.
no.
So I don't know if you...
I heard your question, Tom, and that's a really
cool.
No.
Go for it. Yeah, sorry.
That's a really good. Was in the Alma Tavern, which is a tiny theatre. Absolutely minute. And so that was a constraint, and I knew that from the outset. And so, in fact, the action of the entire play takes place in a single location, in an old air conditioning company's office. And so, yeah, and it had two challenges. One was quite a lot of it involved computers, which, are not very interesting to look at on stage. Someone typing at a computer is not interesting, So I had to think of ways around that. And then the other one was that, as you say, it's on a global scale. One of the computer nerdy character, the genius, goes off around the world at one point. But we never see that, of course. So, I mean, that's one of the things to sort of broaden out from that, I think, that I've learned from playwriting, is that you only have to show certain things, and the rest of the story can kind of, doesn't actually have to happen on stage. You just have to somehow convey to the audience that it's happening without someone, rather clunkily. And I learned that the first play I ever wrote, sort of as an adult, was a friend of mine commissioned me to write a play about the Second World War. And of course, being quite young and inexperienced and ambitious, I wrote this vast kind of Tolstoy-like epic. And it lasted about 4.5 hours in the theatre. And someone in the audience, another friend of mine, said, well, I thought I was going to see a play about World War II, not live through it. So I learned from that. I thought, well, my mistake there was that there's about 6 plays in that, and I should have focused on just one of the stories, and that, I think, is what I've learned, is that you can, well, one, to keep focused on the story, but how much of you show it helps if you keep it quiet, during COVID, I was part of a kind of online play reading group that was curated by Mark Ravenhill, very, very famous. And I got to know Mark quite well, and we were talking once about one of the writing exercises he does with his creative writing students, is that he sort of picks an episode which I think is a woman finds a gun. Okay, he doesn't say where, when, how, or whatever. That's the sort of initiating incident, and then he gets students to write scenes about this, but with the this sort of key event moving in the timeline. So sometimes he gets them to write a scene where the woman actually finds the gun, or then one where the scene is after she's found the gun, but we don't see that on stage, and another one where it's before she finds the gun and we don't see her finding it ever. So do you see what I mean? And he made the point that there are quite a few plays where the main event doesn't even happen during the timescale of the play.
That's
you know,
really
it happens like Beckett plays, you know, for example.
Yeah. And that the other sort of question I had linked to that was when you did your one-man play, and just that creative process of, as it were, sort of transcribing or translating even the original sort of prose non-fiction narrative that you wrote into what was some of the decisions you had to make it work as a excuse me, performance on stage, and working with a director, which must have been, you know, really interesting as well.
Yeah, I mean, the reason I wrote it as a monologue was actually I was having trouble with the prose narrative version. You know, my voice was missing from the prose narrative. I was writing in a very, very dry, rather hands-off style, and I just felt this is really, you know, my supervisor at the time said, "Why are you so frightened of using the word I?" You know, and referring to yourself. And I said, well, I don't know. It just doesn't seem. So I thought, right, if I tell the story, if I write it as if I'm telling it on stage, I will have to be in the story because I'm quite literally telling it to other people. So that was the sort of motive, to find a voice really for this story. And it worked, you know, from that point of view, it worked very well. Yeah, and then actually, I found that actually this is quite a good example of you know, I mean, to cut, I won't tell the whole story because it goes on for hours. But basically, story short, the first time, Tom, you've heard this anyway, but the first time we went as a family to Albania in 2006. Things were still pretty rough there. You know, it hadn't fully recovered from, you know, even 15 years after the end of the communist regime there, which was particularly tough. And, you know, we were surrounded by people begging, trying to sell us dodgy cigarettes, everything, you know, the works. It was pretty when we first arrived. But the key incident of the story is that I went into a bank to change some money. They wouldn't let my wife and children in. And when I came out of the bank, Sarah and the kids were being held against a wall at gunpoint by three men with Kalashnikovs. And I thought, maybe all those people back in Britain who said you're mad taking your children to Albania were right. And, you know, but I was completely determined they would be wrong. But it was a really, really, you know, it probably only lasted about 10 seconds, but it felt like hours. And I thought, like, I've got like about 50 euros worth of Albanian, you know, kind of crazy thoughts. And then mysteriously, these three guys just went away and went and sat on the bonnet of their car and lit up fags and started chatting, and completely mystifying what was going on. So the story in the play is really about me describing our arrival in and that event, but also then trying to think about what that had actually meant. And I think what it meant was that it was Monday morning and they were about to deliver the cash to the bank. And I think they were security guards from the bank, and they were just trying to keep Sarah and the kids out of the way. You know, it wasn't that they weren't actually threatening them. They were just trying to say, no, you go away, because, you know, and because they weren't able to communicate. We didn't speak Albanian, they didn't speak English. So, you know, and so making that into a play, I had to think, well, you know, I could either just stand there and tell the story, you know, or I can use the actual storytelling process so that actually people are seeing is me trying to understand and so on, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, no, absolutely fascinating. Anyone else with any other questions for Tom about anything? Okay, well, I mean, I wanted to ask you about another activity of yours that I suppose is sort of a more recent sort of aspect of your career as a writer, and it's translation. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about any insights into the translator's craft. I mean, you talked a little bit earlier about the feeling that the Bulgarian language might be appropriate for Project X or Y, and maybe the English language might be appropriate for Project Z or whatever. But I'm just thinking like when you're trying to, I guess if it's a piece of writing that is using certain kind of idioms that are kind of very unique to the English language, how do you find an equivalent in Bulgarian, or just really interested in that kind of, say, that sort of thought process or that creative process, really? If you could shed some light on that, it would be great.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I translate from Bulgarian to English. I'm not up to doing it the other way around. But that kind of, that idiom question is one that always, I mean, because you do, and you translate things. I find I translate phrases and think, what? Why is it he suddenly said I'm up to my knees in the sea? For example, a character says that in a novel or something, and when I'm in a supermarket in the middle of Sofia, which is 300 miles from the sea, and it's because that actually means that's an idiom for every grade. I'm up to my knees in the sea. Life's wonderful. And so trying to find, the trying to find is kind of can be quite tricky. Sometimes it's really obvious. There's a saying which, if you translated it literally, means to send someone out for green caviar. Okay, which basically means send someone on a fool's errand. Send them up the garden path, because there's no such thing as green caviar. But obviously, if you translate that in directly, probably most people don't know that there isn't green caviar. So the thing doesn't translate.
Tom, we're losing you again. You've frozen. I don't know if you can still hear us, or. Hello, Tom. Can you hear us? Or hear me?
Like, I mean, a little one, like, this is dead. I can.
Sorry, we lost you there for a little bit. I don't know whether.
Oh, I don't.
We just got.
Yeah. I don't know.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, I think we just after when you talked about the green caviar, which sort of strangely sounds quite nice to me. I don't know, maybe I'm just weird, but sort of whatever you just a little bit, probably what you said after that. I think we lost you. We lost that, I'm afraid. But yeah, I don't know if you,
Okay. Yeah. I mean, yeah, I was really just the idiom thing because there are quite a few that they don't equate either directly or indirectly. We don't really have an equivalent, so you kind of have to think of bit smart ways around that sometimes. So and there are different, there are just slightly different differences in the way that the languages work. So I am cold. You say it is cold to me. So again, it's sort of learning to recognize the differences and how to make up compensatory.
Yeah. The other, sorry, can you? Yeah. Can you still hear us?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's fine.
Yeah, I can.
Yeah, I just you've also become a real sort of champion of Bulgarian literature. Is that fair to say? You've done a lot of work to sort of publicize it, getting these translated poems published in the UK, and also novelists and writers in other forms. I just wondered what is it about? What's exciting about Bulgarian literature today, or if you could recommend some good writers that are ideally in translation, although there may be people in I'm not sure if anyone in this meeting knows Bulgarian, but if you do, I suppose that would be an advantage. But also historically, are there some sort of classic Bulgarian writers that have found an audience in the English-speaking world, and that you could recommend?
Sure. I mean, just to go back, I think very often when you're translating from a language like Bulgarian into English, I think I know all the translators from Bulgarian into English. There are that few of us.
Right.
I can remember saying to Angela O'Dell, who's probably the most famous because she translated Georgi Gospodinov and won the International Booker Prize. We were all in one room together, and I said, "God, if this house burns down, that's Bulgarian literature in English. We'll have to start again. We should never eat the same meals or anything. But, yeah, I just think, I've translated both poetry and fiction and non-fiction actually, but in terms of the sort of literary side of it, as it were, I think what's really exciting is that when you read it, you think, God, there are actually different ways of telling stories which we haven't sort of, that perhaps we haven't explored in English quite so much, coming from a different tradition. And I think it's very noticeable if you read Bulgarian folk tales, they just don't behave like, conventional folk tales or fairy tales. All that stuff about, what's it, the hero's journey and the 3-act structure and all that stuff, forget it. They're just completely, to us, seem very strange because weird things happen all the time. And that's kind of, I think, transferred into some of the most exciting prose that's coming out in Bulgaria at the moment. I've read some extraordinary novels where, just with really interesting ideas behind them. In terms of what's available in translation, I'm afraid that's a little bit more difficult. Well, there is Georgi Gospodinov is widely available in England now. Last time I was over, I saw his book everywhere. I think he's very, very good. And there's some arguments about that in Bulgaria itself. There are people who don't like him at all, who don't like his work at all. But I find it very interesting because he takes stories and sort of almost like takes them apart and then kind of assembles them in new and interesting ways, and different perspectives and so There's also now, in fact, it's just been longlisted for the International Booker. There's a novel by a younger writer called Renee Carabash called She Who Remains, which has been translated by an American woman, Isadora Angel. And weirdly, I translated the film script of that. In fact, that's my title, She Who Remains, because it's a slightly unusual translation of the original Bulgarian. Anyway, and that's on the long list of the Booker Prize, the International Booker this year, and that's interesting too. Again, it takes a very different approach to storytelling, and that's what I find interesting. And on the poetry side, I think again. There are great differences. I mean, I've just published this book of translations of really, he's a modernist, so early 20th century Bulgarian poet Gea Milev, who was an extraordinary radical, both in terms of his writing and his politics. Sort of I don't think he was ever a member of the Communist Party, but he was certainly a sort of anarcho-communist, if you see what I mean. Yeah. And in fact was he was extrajudicially executed by the right-wing government in 1930 when they rounded up about 500 people and garroted them after there was an attempt to assassinate the Tsar, the king of Bulgaria at the time. Milev wasn't involved in that. It was just an excuse. His work is it sounds like I'm plugging my own book, but wait, hey, why not? His work is quite, when you read that, you think, where did that come from? I've never read poetry like this before. I can see where it's kind of drawing on this sort of tradition, modernist, really quite extreme modernism, as it were, sort of Dada and expressionism and so on. But so that's a real eye-opener. And then also and contemporary writers too. And I mean, it's been nice for me. I found that, as I was saying earlier, I tend to write poems just starting from the seemingly least likely things, like old bits of wood on the balcony and whatever. But that's actually that's quite common here. And I've found quite a few poets who write in a sort of similar way. They just start from something very, very ordinary, and kind of explore what they think and feel about it. So I mean, there are plays. I mean, if people are interested, there's an online magazine called Body, just BODY, which is actually based in Prague, but it's run by some Americans. And they've just run a supplement of contemporary Bulgarian poetry in English, featuring not just my translations, other people's too. And that's quite a good window on what's sort of going on in terms of contemporary Bulgarian poetry, at least.
Excellent. Thank you for that summary. It's really, really, it's very intriguing, to know that there's, a kind of a canon that's developing, and at least some of these texts are available in English, and hopefully more will be made available through the great work that you're doing, and other, even if it's just a handful of translators, there's a future for this, it seems.
Yeah, I mean, that is one of the big. I mean, the reason I learned Bulgarian in the first place was that I just wanted to read the literature because I'd heard about it. People were going, "Oh, you should read this, read that," and I just couldn't find it. So I thought, well, okay, there's only one answer to this. I'll have to learn it, and this is before we moved here. So that's how it started. But back then there was hardly anything translated, and now, as more and more stuff is translated, and it's noticeably different now to what it was, like certainly 10 years ago. You've got people like Gospodinov, and you've got people like Renee, and you've got you know, there are little pockets of enthusiasts, you know, in America in particular, who are publishing work from Bulgaria now.
And you mentioned the film script that you translated for She Who Remains. Was that the?
Mm.
And does that mean it's being made by a kind of Western film company, or it's been optioned, or what's the status of that at the moment?
Well, no, what was interesting, because I was approached by the Bulgarian director and said, "Will you translate this script?" I said, "Yeah, sure." And he said, I said, "Oh, if you could," I asked him that very question. I said, "Oh, have you got have you got a Western production company or something?" He said, "No, this is to show they were trying to get money from Germany and France, actually, and Albania, because the story is mostly set in Albania, and they wanted the English version because that was the kind of that's the lingua franca. So I don't think I don't know. They'll probably use my translation for English subtitles, I guess.
Right.
But it was an interesting kind of commission. I hadn't even occurred to me, and in fact, I now realise that a couple of novelists who I translated their novels for they've paid me directly. They haven't got a publisher, and it's not that they're trying to get a publisher in the English-speaking world. They're trying to get a publisher in, say, France or Spain or Germany. And again, so people are using my translation not to get published. Well, that would be a bonus as far as they're concerned, but to get it translated into other languages, because so few people, can do Bulgarian direct.
Right. Intriguing. And is there much in the way of? I guess there's a fair amount of English literature or literature in English translated into Bulgarian, and is it just the sort of obvious kind of best-selling kind of books by Stephen King and the like, or is there a kind of is there an appetite in Bulgaria for maybe slightly more obscure or kind of avant-garde stuff in the West? What's the sort of tastes of Bulgarian readers in that way?
Yeah, I mean, there's a great long tradition of translating from English into Bulgarian, and the classics are obviously pretty well covered, and slightly curious things, like one of the most popular books here is certainly with kind of my generation, or the sort of people who came to adulthood under communism and older. One of their favorites is Jerome K. Jerome's Three Men in a Boat. And you just find it everywhere. They have these wonderful kind of, I know, it's bizarre. And if you go to any, they have these wonderful things, if you literally called reading rooms, but they're really community centres in most towns, and they always have a little library. And if you go in, there's always a copy of it. And I said to one person, I said, what is this? And they said, "Oh no, it's huge. This is massively popular." And so is the novels a bit later from the 1950s of A.J. Cronin, who wrote Dr. Finley's Casebook.
Yeah.
Amongst others. Huge hero here. Again, because the communists approved of him because he was effective. He helped set up the National Health Service, or campaigned for it.
Right.
So he was that kind of thing. And yeah, sort of now contemporarily. I mean, certainly in terms of fiction, obviously all the bestsellers come out remarkably quickly, almost simultaneously in some cases. But yeah, there are people who work on more kind of what you might call a bit more avant-garde, a bit more experimental stuff. But it does tend, you know, I think one of the big problems is well, it really, yeah, but I don't know. There's not a lot of contemporary poetry translated, for example, which is so it's kind of difficult for me when I'm teaching at the university and I'm talking about people who are writing now, and you know, the students have no idea who I'm talking about because you know they've not been able to. Well, they can read English, but they've never heard of them, and so yeah, and also the other thing that's is that translators here are paid very badly. So you know, there's not a great deal of motivation for. So if you know you see some kind of you know, so you want to translate something rather experimental, to use that word. You know, a while, so you have to really be pretty dedicated to.
Yeah, I suppose. I mean, there's a lot of power and responsibility in the hands of the translator because you know, even a minor mistake, it could really sort of ruin the reputation of a writer, and you know, the meaning could be completely lost. You know, especially if it's, I don't know, quite that quite sort of subtle level of metaphor. And I mean, are you aware of any sort of cases in the history of translation where that's happened and the meaning of a text has been sort of quite catastrophically lost because of a translation problem or a translation error?
Well, yeah. I mean, and personally, I have to say yes, that sort of knowledge that you're responsible is terrifying. You know,
Yeah,
I had sleepless nights. I was really delighted when someone agreed to publish the book of Millet poems. But you know, immediately before it came out, I was going, oh, you know, what am I doing? This guy, you know, this is one of the most important Bulgarian poets of the 20th century, and you know, his reputation is in my hands. So it's something I'm very aware of. And like I say, it can be quite terrifying. I mean, there are, I'm sure, you know, cases. I think there used to be a very quite poor translation of Camus' L'étranger, you know, quite often referred to as the outsider, where they actually added stuff in which made you kind of, you know, which sort of altered Merceau, the main character, his actual character a bit. So it's been fixed now because, funnily enough, I just reread it in a new translation that I found in a secondhand bookshop here, and they fixed it.
right.
But so I think there are those kind of things. Um, Again, I'm quite lucky. I mean, Millet's dead. You know, been dead 100 years, fortunately. But I mean, most of the people I work with are very much alive, and most of them speak English, so
Right.
we can effectively collaborate. You know, so I translate a lot of Bulgarian writer, sometimes line English to Bulgarian, and I do vice versa. And so yeah, we have lots of conversations, so we kind of can both feel confident that you know we're not kind of causing damage.
Yeah. Yeah, that must be really a huge advantage because I suppose there's a lot of, you know, you hear about new translations of Tolstoy or, you know, Balzac or people who are long dead and therefore can't complain or can't collaborate. I mean, it's funny, like you mentioned L'Étranger, because I remember when I read Journey to the End of the Night, Céline, and my French isn't good enough to read it in French, but I read the English version, and I seem to remember reading a review of it, because I mean it was published in the 30s, I think, originally, wasn't it? And there was a review of it in the 90s or noughties when I read it, and the reviewer was complaining that there hadn't been a more recent translation because it'd obviously been done in the 30s by an American, because all the kind of slang sounded like a 30s gangster film, you crummy 2-bit hood, and you son of a gun and all. And it's like, well, they're obviously trying to capture the street language of, Paris at that time. And so maybe there was a certain kind of authenticity because, it was published in the 30s. It's obviously set at that time. But then I think this review was sort of saying, like, maybe even so, some of this sounds to the modern ear, wet sort of English ear sort of thing, English speaking ear. That doesn't really make, you know what I mean? English speaking reader, the speaking ear. There's a sort of Dadaist kind of image for you. It's almost a bit too, because the 30s, even in sort of the US or the UK, is far enough from our modern experience that there will be slang words that have just been lost. We don't know the meaning of them, and so you find yourself weirdly looking up the meaning of some obscure American word for a gangster or something, but actually it's supposed to be referring to a French hoodlum in Paris, and so I guess it gets a bit sort of complicated and weird at that sort of point. But yeah. Anyway.
Well,
yeah.
I mean, no, I think what it reminds me of is, again, I teach translation now as well, and it's one of the conversations I have with the students quite often. Is there are there are cultural items, let's say, whether it might be a particular type of shoe or I mean, the most obvious is rakia, which is, a very, very strong spirit drink, the equivalent of poutine, really. People make it in their country houses, and it can be really nice, or it can be really rough, but it's like the national drink of Bulgaria. And it's like, well, the nearest equivalent translation is brandy. I mean, it's made in a similar way to brandy, and it's sometimes called plum brandy.
Right.
But I think if you translate it as brandy, it just it gives all the wrong cultural connotations.
It sounds much too
brandy
classy,
yeah. It is, yeah, exactly. You think of brandy, you think of sort of gentlemen's clubs and all this kind of thing. And when you say rakia, what you actually mean is probably some rather grizzled, old country guy with this still in his back garden, and what have you. So yeah, but I think that's what, that's the sort of equivalent to what you're saying about Celine and the sort of gangster language is, okay, so what do you do about these kind of very culturally specific words and so on, and I think particularly for my Bulgarian students, when they're translating into English, which they do very well, I have to say, I think one of the temptations of them is to sort of over-explain things. And so they'll say, but this, what's it? A souvlaki is a pair of shoes worn typically by kind of by rural farm labourers, particularly at the turn of the last century. And they're it's sort of a bit like a clog, only it isn't a clog, and so on and so on and so on. And I've had people, not translate it, but then sort of left this kind of half a page footnote explaining. And I said, you really don't have to do that. You could just translate it as wooden shoes or whatever,
Yeah.
So those kind of things are perhaps the equivalent now, is like trying to think, okay, how much do I have to explain, or change these very specific things.
Interesting. Yeah.
Mm.
Any other questions from the others in the meeting?
Mm.
Whether you want to type one or speak, feel free to. I mean, I thought just maybe sort of lastly, I was just going to ask you
Mm.
about sort of place, writing about place, and I suppose more specifically travel writing, because obviously that's another, very
Mm.
much sort of huge area of interest of yours and of expertise. And I wondered if you could just sort of tell us a little bit about you have a kind of an attitude or a theory of travel writing, which is very much kind of rooted in encounter. And this is something that you explored in your PhD, and it's something that we've had some
Mm.
really, really productive conversations about over the years. And I just wondered if you could
Mm.
just sort of sketch that out a little bit for the benefit, just because we've been in the MA, and I'm thinking, just because these are MA students here, it's something we've been looking at place writing and travel writing in the over the sort of recent weeks, and I'd just be, I think we'd all benefit from your particular take on it. Yeah.
Mm. Yeah, sure. Yeah, of course, Tom. I mean, it derives, I suppose, from um, reading other travel writing, and sometimes thinking, well, there's a lot of talk about getting into, finding the spirit of a place, or so on and so on. And it's sort of as if there's some kind of universal truth about a place, that you can somehow discover. And there's something uniquely, there's a sort of unique Bulgarianness or a unique Britishness or whatever. And I think it's quite easy to fall into that kind of trap slightly when you're writing, because it's quite easy when you're writing about somewhere else to slip into generalization, um, almost back. Uh, and so I wanted to kind of really that's where the as encounter being that's how do we encounter a place, and kind of questioning my own what is say my own prejudices or assumptions about a place, and approaching it like that, and kind of thinking, yeah, well, this, if I use Bulgaria as an example, Bulgaria is quite, it's obviously a diverse country, 7, 8 million people or whatever, lots of different places, and so on, and also it, it's changing all the time, So so you kind of when you're writing about it, I think what I like to try and do is try and, kind of, I'm not saying hammering this home very firmly, but just try and bear in mind that, what I'm writing about is not some kind of generalized portrait of Sophia or heaven knows where. It's kind of, I have to be writing about it, the places exist in time as well as space. And kind of allowing that for that as well. I think that's kind of mind, and that to try, yeah, I'm very interested in the ideas that we talked about this too before, Tommy, about psychogeography and so on, and approaching place in that sense, and also uh, um, so trying to sort of like viewing the place as like a palimpsest, like a manuscript with lots of different text written on it, and sort of trying to decipher some of those. That's also something I'm really very interested in, and um, and And the other thing, I suppose, again, this is something I think that's just come up through teaching when I've been talking about place and travel writing to my students here, is basically this idea of kind of really just observing really closely, and looking for, I mean, again, to sort of go back, sort of noticing that weird piece of wood on a balcony and wondering what it's for or where did it come from. That also I'm kind of interested in as a way of sort of getting away from this, like I said at the beginning of this answer, this slight trap that you feel like you have to, or that what travel writing is about, like in the great old days of certainly there was quite a lot of this in the 20th century, as I know you're aware of, Tom. It's sort of rather, high-handed English travelers going around saying, well, of course, this is what India is like. And then, listing off a whole load of stereotypes and whatever, to sort of get around that problem that, and as I say, sort of, being a kind of, I think anthropologists call it a participant observer, isn't it? That's what they call them.
Yeah.
It's kind of that's where a lot of my thinking about travel writings come from. In fact, thinking about anthropology, and then also, like I say, this kind of the philosophy of encounter.
Yeah.
That several sort of mid 20th century philosophers wrote about quite a lot, actually. You have people like Emmanuel Levinas, who sort of kind of says, every time you meet someone, it's basically you should always you leave you encounter the other, and you have to sort of well, he says all sorts of kind of quite, he's almost mystic, but he kind of like in this kind of open and so on, and because sort of it's kind of general. And then when you're writing about people, then I think that enables you to write about you allow them to have motives and so on, and feelings and all sorts.
Yeah. No, that's really, really useful stuff, actually. Yeah. I think there's a lot to get one's teeth into there. I think that there is a question from Dee Dee who's typed this, and maybe we'll just, it seems like quite an interesting question to end on. Are there any banned books in Bulgaria? Dee Dee asks. Hi Tom, sorry, can you hear me all right? Yeah, sorry, you've frozen. I don't know whether I'm appearing frozen to you or what.
That's a very good question,
Yeah.
No, you're yeah, if you can hear me, but
yes.
Yeah, we can hear you now. I think so.
Yeah,
I think there's an annoying delay.
Theory,
But go on. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So no, there aren't any banned books as such. I mean, there were obviously an awful lot of them during the communist period. Censorship was very strong, but interestingly, not as fearsome as it was in other Soviet countries. In fact, Bulgaria was renowned for being a little bit liberal in that sense, in terms of publishing books and also screening films. So people would in fact come from places like Poland and East Germany to Bulgaria specifically to watch films or buy books that were banned in other East European communist countries. Um, I don't. Well, I mean, one of the downsides of there not being any banned books in Bulgaria is that you can find really dodgy right-wing texts here, which perhaps is a bit strange. But I've not come across. I mean, they're very good. The literary circles here and publishers are very good at having scandals about things. People get terribly upset about certain books, especially Bulgarian authors who dare to tell what they see as the truth about Bulgaria, which is not necessarily seen as being particularly flattering, let's say. And so there's quite a lot. There's controversy, is what I'm saying. But as far as I know, I don't think anything's been banned since 1989. Yeah, 89 when the regime did, really.
Edie, did you have any other questions or any other comments you wanted to make?
No, not really. I just wondered kind of what the breadth of diversity of publications are.
Right. That's a slight. Yeah, I mean, the diversity is possibly the one thing, because I mean, I'm talking about literature, not in Bulgarian literature extends across the range of styles and approaches and so on. I mean, really, in terms of the representation of non-Bulgarian literature in Bulgarian, I mean that because of the well, yeah, this fact that there's a kind of there's only a limited number of translators, so we're looking at this kind of practical rhythm. Okay.
Hi, sorry, I don't know. Yeah, whether there's a delay again, but yeah, whether you finished, Tom, your point, or we're still waiting to. No. Okay, that's
good. Right. Yes, I think I had finished, but whether that the last sentence or two catches up, I don't know. I was just really saying that the diversity of translated literature could probably be improved, but we're kind of stuck practically with what the industry, the publishing industry, can afford, really.
Yeah, no, fair point. I think we'll stop there if that's all right with everybody. Okay. Tom, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your insights and tips with us. Lots of really useful stuff there for us to get our teeth into, and it also really reflects well on your extraordinary breadth and diversity of your interests. And I felt like I learned a lot, not least about translation and Bulgarian literature and travel writing and place writing. So it was, we really appreciate you joining us this morning. So and it'd be great to have you back. It's become a regular sort of engagement, so it's always a pleasure. And there's usually a lot has happened in the intervening times, so that there's always something fresh and new to talk about, which is always fun. And thanks to everyone who came along, Didi and Sayantani, and I know Tracy had to leave a bit earlier. So I hope that was useful for you as well. So excellent. Yeah. All right.
Well, can I just say thank you very much, Tom? As ever, it's a pleasure. And maybe next time in person.
That would be so good. Yeah. We'll try and we'll work on that. Try and make that happen. Very good, because I think many years ago, it feels like you did come a couple of times, maybe in person, to sort of do.
Oh
well,
God, yeah, I mean quite regularly. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
So yeah, we'll
Yeah.
try and coincide it with you being back in the country, or we'll work it out for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah. Brilliant. Oh, super.
All right.
Excellent.
Thanks, everyone. Take care. Have a good rest of the day.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye bye.
Yeah.